and welcome to the latest edition of Immigration Unpacked. This is part two of a two-part series where Tanya, our head of business immigration, and I talk about some recent changes to the sponsor license guidance. And some of the changes aren't new, some of them are just reinvigoration of best practices that we've always told our clients they should be doing, but it's now codified within the sponsor guidance saying this is what you must do as a sponsor. So last episode, we spoke about new concepts such as the eligible role concept and the requirement for sponsors to be up to date with the sponsor guidance, every iteration of the sponsor guidance, the sort of new rules that the Home Office have put in place about the cause reflecting the job in practice. But again, this was always the case. It always had to be that way. So we're going to press on today with there's a new duty to inform workers of their employment rights with mandatory record keeping. So this is actually something brand new within the guidance. There's never been this instruction before that this must be provided to sponsors. Tanya and I spoke with our colleague Roshan Dykes in our employment department about this a few weeks ago, and we've got a podcast about it. But briefly, in summary, Tanya, can you tell us about this new duty?
Absolutely. So, in short, sponsors are now required as of the 8th of April to ensure that any person who's being sponsored after that date is given absolute detail of their employment rights, and that's going to be enforced with mandatory record keeping requirement by the Home Office to ensure that sponsors give to every new sponsored member of staff details of their employment rights. The guidance and the announcement provided a list of some of the mandatory employment rights that they require staff to be notified of. But they were very clear to make sure that it was not an exhaustive list. And so that has led to many questions. What is required? Well, certainly we would suggest that you ensure that you provide them with details as to the annual leave that they're allowed to take, their employment rights pursuant to the recent employment legislation, their right to strike, their right to take maternity leave or paternity leave or parental leave, sickness benefits, the right to strike, for example. The list goes on, and we have written about this, and there's a very detailed article by us posted on our website. What I would say is that it might well also be good practice to go back and look at your other sponsored workers. That's not a mandatory requirement, but I'm curious to discover whether the Home Office in due course are going to make this retrospective. And so it may well be an opportunity for sponsors to go and do a quick mini audit of everybody that they currently sponsor and or are thinking about sponsoring, and just check what's going on your right to work checks, for example, that audit, but specifically making sure that you start to now give people a document, signpost them to your handbook, make sure that they've seen and understood their employment rights as part of their sponsorship with you now and going down the road.
And the important bit is to keep a record of it,
The
that
important,
you
yeah,
must be able to show the Home
that you
Office that
have
you
done
have
this.
given this
Yes,
information. And it could be spread out across a multitude of documents. Some of these provisions might be in your employment contract with your employee, some might be in a company handbook, some could be standalone policies which are on your intranet.
indeed.
So
Yeah,
it's worthwhile perhaps thinking about collating them into one place if that's
yes,
feasible, and
absolutely.
then making them available somewhere on your intranet so anyone can go and look at them, and then informing your entire staff population, not just sponsored workers, but everybody, because it does impact everyone, informing your employees of where to go to look for that information. Anyway, we've done a very long and detailed podcast on that, so I encourage you to
Uh,
go and listen to it, and
uh,
we've also got articles on our website about
Ab
it too.
ab Absolutely. I think a collation of documents where you might find your company handbook, your grievance procedures, your how to take out a loan documents, your health and safety requirements is a really good idea. It should absolutely be on your inside your intranet as opposed to on your outward facing website. I do think, and not to belabor the point, but the record keeping strand runs through all of the new changes introduced, and it's going to be very likely that in tandem with the new requirement that sponsors must regularly check into into the excuse me, into the sponsor management system, which is the online portal that sponsors manage their license through and assign certificates, make requests through, is to make sure that the record keeping branch and tranche of these changes is seen in everything that you do, because that's where we're seeing more and
Mm.
more of these changes coming from the Home Office. It's all about compliance. It's which goes hand in hand or hand in glove with enforcement, because the enforcement action comes when sponsors have not been compliant, which I
Yeah.
think is going to take us very neatly into the second half of this second
Exactly.
part of the podcast.
Exactly. So yeah, so it's important to remember that you are in a regulatory environment with the Home Office. And so if you're not keeping records of what you're doing, they're not going to just take you on your word to say, yes, I did that. They need to see evidence that something was done. So this is, it's
Definitely.
always been important, within management of your sponsor license that you are keeping records, but there's less tolerance now where records are lacking
Or
for the Home Office just to say, yes, well, we trust that you did that. Please make sure you've got a way of keeping the record going forward. It's now, if you don't have that record, then we believe you've been non-compliant. So it's super important.
We are
So
definitely,
just
sorry, I was just to add
sorry.
to your point, and then I will let you carry on. I'm sorry. We're definitely seeing far less discretion being exercised where there is a lack of compliance than we have before. So, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so one of the OG record keeping things is right to work checks. And so the new guidance has been updated to say that you must conduct right to work checks for employees. We knew that before. Of course, all sponsors must do right to work checks on or before any employee starts. So not just sponsored employees, but absolutely anyone. The guidance has been updated to say right to work checks must be done for employees and engaged workers. So it's quite interesting because the actual right to work guidance was updated some time ago to say that you might want to do right to work checks on anyone who's working in your office. So this would include people who aren't, technically classified as employees, so it could be consultants. And then I think it was changed to say that you should do that if you're a sponsor. But now the actual sponsor guidance has been updated to confirm that any engaged worker has to have a right to work
Right.
check done.
I mean,
But
it's an
sorry.
express requirement that engaged workers, and by engaged workers, the Home Office means anybody who is not even a direct employee of the sponsor. So contractors, consultants, agency workers, even those where they're being supplied to you because it's a supply of labor, we the Home Office are going to are not, it's not that they are going to, they now do require right to work checks to be undertaken on all of those sorts of individuals, those different groupings. And so what we would advise is that you review them now and then make sure that from now onwards, you are ensuring that right to work checks have been undertaken on those specific groups, even if they're not directly paid by you or directly engaged by you, but engaged by you. When I say directly engaged, i.e., they're not under a contract of employment with you. Anybody that sort of comes into contact with you, provide a service or a skill, you must now undertake and record or ensure that right to work checks have been done by the service provider and that you see them and that you keep records of them so that you are covered by the right to work obligations and the record keeping of said right to work
Yeah.
obligations.
Exactly. And this could extend to sort of populations that you might not even think about who are sort of providing services to your firm. So it could be security guards, for instance, who often aren't direct employees, but would come from an agency. It could also
Cleaning
be cleaning
staff.
services. Yes, exactly. So this potentially it's not just your workforce, the people you are seeing around your
No.
office, around your business. It's anyone who is coming in to provide you with a
Hmm.
service. So you might need to think about your cleaning staff and your security staff. And if you haven't done those right to work checks, do them now to make sure that you are compliant, and make sure when you are having new people come in that you're doing the right to work check for them before they're permitted to start work. The Home Office can see, because the right to work checks are mostly done online now, where somebody
Yes.
has a visa. Where someone has a passport, it can still be done manually, a British passport or an Irish passport. But on the whole, you're going to see these are being done online through share codes, and those share codes are date and time stamped. So the Home Office knows exactly when you did those right to work checks. So it's really, really important that you're updating any of your sort of onboarding process charts to include checking the right to work for contractors and agency workers, looking at your sort of labour supply arrangements, and making sure that your onboarding process includes the right to work check, and doing it before anyone is permitted to start work. So there's just an expansion of what you're already doing for your employees. It now must be for anyone who's coming in to work for you. Um,
And can I also add that it's very important to remember that right to work checks are valid, if that's the right term, for the period that a person has a right to work. So if someone's visa is expiring, you you're employing them for a period of, say, 5 years, but their visa is only valid for 2.5 or 3 years. You must make sure that at the point that they have made their in-time extension or switching application or whatever it might be, you do a right to work check, and then a subsequent right to work check when their new visa or their extension has been approved. And those three right to work checks, or
mhm,
however many more you need to do on a particular individual, indeed on all individuals, are kept within the relevant records, that they're all collated, it's all clear who they all belong to, that you have a proper
mhm.
tracking system so that you are able to produce the records as needed and also refer back to them.
Yes.
Sponsors sometimes forget that an extension where an extension needs to be done, that a new right to work check needs to be done, and in fact two new right to work checks need to be done.
Mhm. Yes, exactly. Thank you. Yeah, so it's not just that initial step of doing the right to work check, but
Mm-mm,
it's the necessary follow-up checks if someone
as
is
well.
is is time limited in the UK because they're on a visa. Um, As part of the changes, the Home Office have also given themselves new mandatory powers for revoking a sponsor license. A mandatory revocation is now if a business is required to be licensed or hold a certain regulatory registration, if they fail to hold that license or regulatory registration, or if they fail to renew it in time, if they need it to legally operate in the UK, then that can be a mandatory ground for revocation. I'm not sure if there's much more to say on that, Tanya. It's
And
just make make sure you're renewing all of your licenses in time if you require to renew them in order to legally operate in the UK. But it's just an
absolute it's
expansion, isn't it, of the mandatory grounds for revocation.
and it's an expansion of enforcement powers and
Mm,
enforcement actions, which I mean, I know I sound like I'm banging on to the same drum, but I'm doing it wisely and I hope in a cautionary way. But we are really seeing a hardening of attitudes across the board in terms of compliance and enforcement. And these are all little flares that the government is sending up as to how they're going to be operating, and that they will take action. It's not that they
mm.
could take action, which was
The phrasing.
the modus
Yeah,
operandi and the
yeah.
phrasing. Thank you. It's now that they absolutely are going to take action. Previously it was, we will contemplate doing so. Please don't be
Mhm.
naughty. Now it's, you've been naughty, so now we're going to take action.
Yeah,
And you're on
exactly.
notice that we are
Yeah,
going to take action.
yeah. It seems to be more black and white.
It is. There are fewer grey
Playing field.
areas.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so in line with this and how the Home Office are approaching suspensions and revocations of licenses, they have told us that if they have a reasonable suspicion
Mhm.
that a breach has occurred, they can suspend or revoke a license. So previously, if hard evidence, I suppose, would have, or confirmation that the breach has occurred would be required. But because they are now receiving data from other government sources, they have much greater oversight
Hmm.
over data that they previously would have needed to go to each individual sponsor for. For example, PAYE data, so salary data, so they would have to analyze that to see whether there'd been any underpayment, I suppose if they had come to you or gone to a sponsor and they asked for your PAYE in real time information. And if you were using a representative or if you were doing it diligently yourself, you might have seen that there were some underpayments. You would have been able to sort of rectify them or explain why those underpayments have occurred. It could be that someone went on paternity leave, and so that led to a dip
Right.
in salary, or maternity leave, or they were on long-term sick leave.
Hmm.
And again, those types of leave should be reported through the sponsor management system so the Home Office can, verify it. But, it may have been that in the past they weren't reported, but then you make a late report and the Home Office, you show the Home Office, we've got processes in place now, and they might take a view to allow you to keep your license. But now what we're seeing is, no, that's a breach, that's either a suspension or a revocation.
Yes, I mean, I think we are moving away from the concept of innocent until proven guilty, which is adopting a criminal term. We are definitely seeing a move towards if they have a reasonable suspicion, they will suspend and ask questions afterwards. The action
Hmm.
will happen, and then there'll be an investigation rather
Yes.
than an investigation or an audit or please can we come in? We've noticed some unusual activity, or we noticed that you haven't done X. Would you like to explain why this has happened? And please provide a list of documentation and evidentiary pieces. Now there'll be action, and then a sponsor will be required to justify and or explain and or provide. So it's action and then explanation rather than, unfortunately, what has always been good normal practice from the Home Office. And I think this just clearly demonstrates an ongoing of a sort of hardening approach and consideration of what it means to be a sponsor. And
Yeah.
so I know we mentioned this last time, but the Home Office have always had in the guidance that sponsorship is a privilege, not a right, which is a sort of, it's such an interesting term for them to have picked on and then used throughout the guidance. But it's reinforced twice at the beginning of
Mm.
the new guidance. And this is a clear demonstration that it is a privilege, not a right. And so it means that, as we've said, the element of discretion is removed. But what it also means is that where there is a non-deliberate or not even a breach, as it will
Mm.
be regarded by the Home Office, a breach of record keeping duties or reporting duties, even if it isn't considered to be deliberate or even known about, that can still lead to suspension and or revocation,
Yes.
which is a new additional concept that has been introduced by the Home Office into the requirements to be a sponsor and to maintain sponsor duties and responsibilities and to undertake them rather. Um,
Exactly. And this is why there's the new express requirement that sponsors read the sponsor guidance,
yes,
because if you've completed that duty, you can't then say, I didn't know I was
I was
supposed to
supposed
do
to do this.
something. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's circular, it goes hand in hand, all of these changes. Yeah. So no more innocent mistake,
No
I
more
think,
innocent
or
mistakes, no more
unknowing mistake.
we
Yeah.
we acted in good faith, but oops, we're terribly sorry, and we've now rectified it.
Yeah.
I think that, as we've said before, that that's no longer going to be a sort of an acceptable defense or
Mm.
explanation of why
Yes.
something had happened.
Mhm.
And so it's therefore incredibly important that sponsors have very robust compliance systems, tracking systems, HR systems in place. And it's now equally as important that sponsors regularly go into the sponsor management system, check their specific message boards where the Home Office will post, there's been a change. Well, they'll post if they have updated guidance, if there's a specific duty, that there's a new X or particular role requirement to be undertaken rather. Um, and we know that the Home Office monitors who checks into their sponsor management systems and checks their message boards. And so, as I think we've previously suggested and advised, set a marker in somebody's calendar within your HR or people management teams to make sure that one of your key personnel goes into the sponsor license, checks the message board, actions it as necessary, because the Home Office are looking, they're
Yeah,
watching.
exactly. And so within that, we've got two other new mandatory grounds for revocation. So one is if you're sponsoring someone in an ineligible role. So we
Yes.
spoke about this in part one of
Hmm.
this new concept of the eligible role, and it's always been there. It's just new terminology, but it's about the genuineness of the role. So just to sort of recap on what is an eligible role. An eligible role exists at the point that the cause is assigned. It requires the role holder to perform specific duties and responsibilities and hours as set out on the certificate of sponsorship assigned to them. It meets all route requirements, including skill level and salary, national minimum wage requirements, and working time regulations. So if you breach any of those, then that is now a mandatory ground for
Hmm.
revocation. So if you're not paying the right salary, if you're not paying above national minimum wage, and if you're not complying with the working time regulations, then you are facing a mandatory ground for revocation. So the role also has to be, of course, appropriate for the business. And it's not just when the cause is assigned that you have to meet all of these requirements, but for the duration of the sponsorship. So it's a real hard, I mean, it's really all guns blazing, isn't it, Tanya? So I think what sponsors need to do is that they need to make sure they are giving their accountants or their payroll the correct information about salary requirements. It's worth reviewing that and make sure that you have robust systems in place to make updates. You are making sure you are giving your payroll accountants information where pay has to increase because national minimum wage goes up, and that's usually April each year. So it's a diary reminder in the diary, maybe for March, just for whoever's in charge of giving that payroll information to the accountants or to payroll, that they are earmarking who needs a salary increase because of national minimum wage, and making sure that the right new salary details are being given to the payroll accountants. We have people who come to us where they've inadvertently not paid national minimum wage because they didn't give that instruction. But it's really a zero tolerance approach to that now. If you fail to do that, if the Home Office see that you're not paying national minimum wage, they will revoke your license. On the flip side, then you also can't artificially inflate a salary
Right.
just to be able to sponsor somebody. So this applies. I mean, I think it's always sort of been there for indefinite leave to remain as a rule, but it applies to entry claimants' permission to stay and permission to stay applications as well. And the last change is the home. Well, I mean, it's not really a change. The Home Office have always required it, but you must have systems which enable you to meet all of your sponsor duties. And so, if I think
Yes.
if sponsors are not sure whether their systems are robust enough, definitely get in touch with your immigration advisor, have them come in to do what we would term a mock audit of your systems, to test them, to stress test them for compliance with your sponsor obligations. Also think about training, think about who in your organization requires immigration training. It's going to be anyone who's responsible for the recruitment of staff, and could include department heads because they will
Yes.
have sponsored employees. So, it's all very well HR knowing what to do, but if actually your department heads or your team leaders or your line managers don't know that they should be informing HR that there's something going on with a particular sponsored employee, whether there's issues with absences or whether there's going to be changes to their job, whether they're talking about potential promotions or potential move into different jobs, then they need to know that these could be triggers that are going to impact that person's visa, and they have to let HR know so that they can get the relevant immigration advice for that employee, so that their visa is or their job is always going to be permitted by their visa.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important that, as you as you rightly identified, not just HR teams or recruitment teams are aware of the requirements, but that line managers or the people within a department or a team who make decisions about whether they need to hire a new person because their team needs to expand, or whether they got a particular business need for somebody. It's it's really important that there is some understanding within that sector in your organizations of who also can be sponsored, and what a suitable role is, what an eligible role looks like. We're not saying, we're not expecting everybody to overnight become immigration law experts, but it is important to have a general understanding of the concepts, and also to have a general understanding of when they don't know something, to speak to us so that we can give guidance and advice. I mean, we would say that we're lawyers, but it has always been very important to us as lawyers that we do the best for our clients. And that means helping before something becomes a crisis,
Mm.
to making sure that there are proper procedures in place, that if in doubt, this is going to sound so silly, but if in doubt, reach out. Um,
Yes.
and I, because it's better to prevent something from happening, particularly now, particularly in this new climate where we're seeing a greater onus on sponsors to have it done properly in the first place, to make sure that sponsors are themselves complying, that to make sure that enforcement action doesn't come down. And so, as I say, prevention, isn't it true what they say, that prevention is
It
better than
is.
cure? I
Yeah,
mean,
exactly.
the oldies are the goodies, but they segue into sort of making sense, because 10-day windows, 10 working day windows for reporting, which is what a number of the timelines for reporting changes as they have occurred. That's not a very long, it's 2 working weeks. And so
Mm.
um, making sure that there is a general understanding is going to be vital across organizations, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And I would just sort of reinforce what Tanya said. Don't sleep on this. The current climate is harsh. We do know that the Home Office are ramping up their compliance activities. They're doing a lot of it at arm's length through data they're receiving from other government agencies. So now is the time. Don't put it off any longer. I think it used to be the case that people thought they got their license. There was a lot of work around, getting the license in place, and then it would just sort of tick over, being aware that there were sort of ongoing obligations,
Hmm.
but it was probably seen as something quite administrative. Now it must be part of your governance processes. You must protect your license. You are in a regulatory regime with the Home Office effectively. You have obligations that you need to meet. You must make sure you're meeting them if you want to keep your license. So so act now to prevent any distress later. That's our advice.
Yes, we don't mean to sound alarmist, but we are moving into a sort of a new horizon and landscape of the compliance hand fitting inside the enforcement glove. I know that's a terrible analogy and I apologize, but they do go run in tandem with each other. And the advent of data sharing, as you've already said, it will cause things to run on a pace, and activity will be happening behind the scenes, because HMRC readily share their data with the Home Office. So do the NHS, so do other government departments, because we are really seeing a greater move to, I know it doesn't always feel like it, but joined up government. And so government departments do now talk to each other, and they do share information, and and data. And so it is increasingly important to be mindful of the vigilance, and it shouldn't take over your lives, but it is just will need to be a sort of a, a constant bedrock within the management of a sponsor license.
Tanya, it's really been a pleasure talking to you again on sponsor compliance. Despite it being very, very harsh at the moment, there's a lot that sponsors can do to protect themselves, and we just advise that they act now. Thanks very much for joining me today. And I think in the next episode, you'll be seeing me and Tanya again talking about more sponsor compliance issues. So stay tuned.
Thank you.